what I want to achieve this afternoon is to pass on some knowledge that actually I haven't really gained during my time at IBM and before that. It actually goes back to my A-levels. I did A-level psychology, got very interested in it, and so some of these anecdotes I'd like to pass on come from that time in my life, and I'd like, ideally, for you to be able to pass them on too. And they're all relevant to user testing. So my other dream is that whenever you're planning a user testing session, that some of these anecdotes will help you make your experimental design better, and therefore you'll get better results. A little bit of housekeeping as well. Some of the stuff I'm going to talk about is based on research that I did when I was publishing an article on UX Booth a couple of years ago of the same name. So if you don't want to furiously take down notes, you can Google that and you'll pretty much get the notes. Also, InfoQ are recording the session, so you're welcome to go and look at it there. They also have a load of other really great content, so it's really worth having a look. Okay. So our story begins in the late 19th century in Germany, where a secondary school math teacher named Wilhelm von Oster was very well respected as a math teacher, but had this side interest in animal intelligence. And he was really obsessed with this idea that animals were actually far more intelligent than we give them credit for. And he wanted to prove that empirically, and he wanted to spread the word and kind of, I guess, make a name for himself. So he set about the task of finding a subject. Now, his first choice was a cat. And what he wanted to do with the subject, of course, was to teach it some sort of skills which showed that it was intelligent. And he wanted to teach it mathematics. And the cat lovers of you out there may know that if you try and teach a cat mathematics, you're probably going to get scratched. And that's basically what happened. So he moved on. He thought, the cats, this is not going to work. But bears might. The bear lovers of you out there may realize that you're going to get maimed if you try and teach a bear maths. That didn't happen, fortunately, but he did give up on that pretty quickly, too. But then he decided to try it with a horse. This is Hans, the horse. And he devised a technique for teaching Hans arithmetic. And he would communicate with Hans using German. And Hans would communicate with Wilhelm by stamping his feet. So Wilhelm would ask a question, what is 1 + 1? And Hans would stamp his feet twice, and therefore he could do mathematics. And they spent a lot of time working together, building up this routine. And it was very exciting because it did appear that Clever Hans, as he became known, was capable of performing arithmetic to the same sort of level as a 14-year-old. So this became quite interesting to a lot of people. And Wilhelm and Clever Hans would tour the country. And indeed, they would tour Europe, wowing crowds all over the place with Hans's amazing arithmetic ability. And so they built up quite a lot of notoriety. And at one point, the scientific community got involved, and they were very interested in this. So it was in 1904, a commission of scientists studied the show, and they had a look at it, and they concluded that actually, yeah, this was valid. Clever Hans was able to do maths. But there was another chap called Oskar Funkst, and he just wasn't so sure. So he spent some time studying the show as well. And he would just, he wasn't sure why he was skeptical, but he just started messing with them a little bit. So he would say, okay, Wilhelm, I'd like you now to repeat that, but stand further back from Hans. And when he started doing this, he noticed that there was a correlation between the distance between the experimenter, Wilhelm, and the subject, Clever Hans. When they were further apart, the responses were less accurate until they were completely inaccurate. And that was interesting. And he carried on his research a little bit, and essentially he concluded that there was something clever going on, but it wasn't quite as clever as we thought. What was actually going on was that there was a lot of nonverbal communication going on between Wilhelm and Clever Hans, and they'd learnt to communicate quite clever things without people ever seeing it. So Hans wasn't adding up numbers, but he was reading the body language of Wilhelm. And to cut a long story short, as Hans was stamping his feet and approaching the correct answer to a question, Wilhelm's body language would show him that he was getting close. So Wilhelm would be watching and he'd be getting very excited, and as Hans got to the right number, he would really show that in his expression, and Hans would stop stomping, and Wilhelm would be excited, and everyone would clap, and this was basically it. So actually, it doesn't sound to me like it would have been that hard to detect that there was no mathematics involved. So the problem was that Wilhelm had this hypothesis, and he was determined to show that it was valid, and it kind of blinded him. But what's also interesting is that after it was debunked, the show did not stop touring. In fact, it continued to tour for quite a long time. So not only was Wilhelm not deterred by this, but actually the audiences were still prepared to pay to see this act. And it really shows that once you want to believe something, you will believe it. This is something which may affect the way we do user testing, because quite often I think the way we work is that as designers, we will come up with a design, and it'll also be left to us to test it. And once you've created something, you kind of want to show that it's good. So we can be forgiven, I think, for being susceptible to this effect too. And so it's quite a big problem. And one of the solutions to this problem is to actually split the responsibility of experimenter and researcher. So one of the solutions then is to, as a designer, we're effectively a researcher. And if you split that into researcher and experimenter, then you can create a gap between the person who's invested in the outcome and the person who's actually going to go and do the testing for that outcome. And so this is something that people do in scientific research. One person has a hypothesis, another person tests it. And that means that you can really extend the gap between those two roles and introduce things like single blind techniques and double blind techniques. I will very quickly explain them. A single blind technique is when you run an experiment and you don't tell your subjects what you're trying to find out. In this case, I'm saying that the researcher, or the person who's done the design, would not tell the experimenter what they're trying to find out. They would simply help them come up with a method of testing. So a way of kind of giving out tasks. A double-blind technique, which we'll talk about again, is when you actually purposefully deceive the subject or the person running the experiment so that they think they're trying to find out something else. And this just helps you tear apart the problem that you're going to have with people who want to believe something that they want to believe. And slightly related to this is funding bias. And Turner and Spillick in 2006 did a bit of research into the tobacco industry. And they found that when the tobacco industry funds research into cognitive ability and smoking, they always conclude that tobacco improves cognitive ability. But if anyone else funds it, they find out something completely different. And so there's a lot of problems with bias in research. Just trying to go to the next slide here. Okay. I'm going to skip forward to the 1920s now. Western Electric had a plant. It was a factory outside Chicago in a place called Hawthorne. And it was a plant which produced components for the telephony industry. And the people who owned the plant wanted to figure out how they could increase productivity. And they had this hypothesis that if we mess with the lighting, that might have an effect. i.e. if we make the factory conditions brighter, perhaps people will be a bit more productive. And they just wanted to see what would happen. So they conducted this experiment. When they started doing this, they would increase the lighting, and I think they would track units per hour, units per day. And then they would dim the lighting and see what that did. And they found that when you increase the lighting, you increase productivity. And they also found that when you decrease the lighting, you increase productivity. And this puzzled them a little bit. And so they took a few of their workers, they took 5 workers, and they relocated them in a special room where they could monitor them in more detail. And so the experimenters were much closer to the subjects. And they increased the lighting, and productivity increased again. And they decreased the lighting, and it increased again. And so they were still puzzled. And eventually what they concluded was that lighting doesn't have any impact on productivity. But if you watch a bunch of people, and they know they're being watched by scientists, they start working really hard and turn into very productive worker bees. So here's another problem that we may face in our day jobs. If you're doing face-to-face user testing, then the subjects are acutely aware that they're being observed, and they're probably not going to act very naturally. So that's a pretty big problem. There are a few solutions. One is to conduct remote user testing, maybe not instead of, but possibly as well as. And to some extent, people then feel they're not being watched. Although, to be fair, they're going to be aware that they are being monitored to some degree. Using web analytics is a very good part of the solution. People are always being watched. Essentially, when they're using websites, they are being watched. But I don't think they feel like they're being watched, and that's about as natural as it gets. So comparing web analytics with the findings of user testing can be quite powerful. And I think to take it to the next level, you can actually observe web analytics, and you can take a task, such as finding a set of items from the homepage. And in web analytics, you can probably get a good idea, based on a high volume of users, how long that takes. Or there'll be some tasks which you can isolate in the analytics. If you then repeat that task, or include it in your user testing, regardless of whether you're actually interested in the results, you can at least then compare 2 things. And you may find that there's a huge variance, i.e. it takes people half the time to log in when they're face-to-face than it does when they're in their own environment. And if you do find something significant like that, then it's quite interesting, because you can reasonably assume that people don't perform as well as they do at home as they do in a testing environment. Okay, I'm going to jump to the 1950s now, where a guy called Solomon Asch was very interested in researching conformity. Conformity became a really hot topic in the decades that followed the Second World War for some fairly obvious reasons. There was a lot of research into this. You've probably heard of the Stanley Milgram studies, where people were made to believe that they were electrocuting people, for example. And that's a very good example of the double-blind technique. People were told that they were electrocuting people, and we wanted to see how much the subjects of that could handle. But actually, Milgram was not interested in that at all. He just wanted to see if he could make people do that. A few ethical issues there, and a few ethical issues with what Asch did. But essentially, he would run these tests, which he billed as perceptual tests. He would show diagrams to a group of people where there would be a bunch of lines on the wall. One would be short, another section would be different lengths, and he'd say, which 2 lines are the same length? Which seemed like a pretty simple task. Not all of the subjects would be genuine subjects, however. If there were 10 people in the room, 9 of them would be actors told which answer to give, and only 1 of the people would be a real test subject. Instead of explaining that any further, I'm just going to show you a clip of a reconstruction of this.
The Ash experiment is one of psychology's oldest and most popular pieces of research. A volunteer is told that he's taking part in a visual perception test. What he doesn't know is that the other participants are actors, and he's the only person taking part in the real test, which is actually about group conformity.
Please begin. The experiment you will be taking part in today involves the perception of line length. Your task will be simply to look at the line here on the left and indicate which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. So, for example, if you...
The actors have been told to match the wrong lines. The volunteer will be monitored to see if he gives the correct answer or if he goes along with the opinion of the group and gives the wrong answer. In the first test, the correct answer is 2.
1. 1.
1.
2.
1.
Once again, the correct answer is 2.
3.
3. 3.
3.
3.
The Ash experiment has been repeated many times, and the results have been supported again and again. We will conform to the group. Again, we're very social creatures. We're very much aware of what the people around us think. We want to be liked. We don't want to be seen to rock the boat, so we will go along with the group. Even if we don't believe what people are saying, we'll still go along.
1.
1.
1.
1.
Group dynamics is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology.
1. 1.
So yeah, I find that quite amusing. I also feel quite sorry for the chap. Yeah. So there was a point where we were all kind of chuckling, and it's the point where a minute in, the only guy who's not an actor suddenly looks like a broken man. And I think he is quite damaged by what he's seeing, because quite clearly everyone's getting the wrong answer. And that's not okay. And his faith in everyone around him and beyond is shattered. And fortunately, the people were debriefed after this, but it's a fairly tough thing to put someone through. But it just goes to show the power of our wish to conform. So, I'm just going to jump back to my slides. So what does that tell us about people? Well, we're kind of like sheep. We do like to be part of the herd. And we can be very upset by not feeling part of it. So in a user testing session, if you're running a session with lots of people together, we're kind of susceptible to this problem too. So if people are going through a series of tasks in the same order, then we may have a problem where people can overhear each other's responses, and that's really going to influence their answers. You may find that you get data which suggests that there are very strong trends, and those trends might not be as strong as you think. Kind of related to this is the hippo effect, highest paid person's opinion. And if you do have the hippo effect, you may find people's responses polarizing towards that of perhaps the boss, perhaps the product manager, maybe the person with the most cash or the most influence. And that's a problem too. So we need to find solutions to this problem. And I think one of them is that there's an inherent problem with group testing, that people can overhear each other's responses. One of the quick ways around that is to randomize the task order for a set of tasks. It at least means that if you are testing with a bunch of people in the same room, maybe they won't be overhearing each other's responses to the same answers at the same time. And therefore, you get slightly less polarization. I don't know how many of you test in that respect, in that way. I've done that in the past. Sometimes it's unavoidable. You're given a morning to do your user testing, So you get everyone in a room together, and you do it that way. Obviously, if you can get people to run solo sessions, that can be good. It kind of depends on what their natural environment's like as well. So there's a few factors to consider there. Okay. Now we're going to talk about demand characteristics a little bit. So Weber and Cook in 1972 were kind of way ahead of their time, actually. They started talking about personas, which we didn't start doing that until very recently. And they came up with 4 personas that they'd observed from doing research with people. They found that people generally fall into one of 4 categories: the good subject, and the good subject figures out thinks they figured out your hypothesis and tries to adhere to that to show you that you are right. And you've got the faithful subject, who pretty much just tries to behave themselves and follow instructions. You've got the apprehensive subject, who's a little bit unsure of themselves, feels very uncomfortable in a test environment, and may behave slightly differently. And then you've got the negativistic subject, who really just tries to sabotage the whole testing session. And this is sometimes called the screw you effect. There's actually, so sometimes I do little bits of testing at work where I just get people in the office to test something. Obviously, they're not our real end users, and it's not incredibly valid, but sometimes that's as good as you're going to get at some point. And I often like to get one of my colleagues, who I'm going to refer to as Steve, as it is his name, and I get Steve over to my desk, and I know that he's thinking, screw you, because Steve worked on one of our legacy products, and I think he worked on it through the 90s, put his heart and soul into it, and he believes that that's the product we should still be supporting, whereas actually we're trying to work on a new generation. So he's thinking, screw you, why do we have to make this new stuff? What was wrong with the stuff that I made? And so I know that I'm going to get really negative feedback out of Steve, and he's going to find all of the problems, and he's going to go out of his way to struggle with the software. And I don't really mind that. I mean, I mind a little bit, because it hurts a little bit sometimes. But I'm not about to run off and change my designs based on what Steve thinks. However, I do like to listen to what he comes up with, because sometimes he'll pose a question which perhaps I haven't posed myself. And that's useful. In fact, all of these personas are quite useful. The good subjects are useful. So are the apprehensive ones. But you've got to use your intuition as a designer and researcher to know how to act on this stuff. Also, it is quite useful to know, to be able to run tests and get data which is not influenced by demand characteristics. And there's really only one really good way of doing that, which is to have loads and loads of participants, so that the few who show these characteristics very strongly are diluted by everyone else. So that's the solution to that, and it's maybe a little easier said than done. But I think it's very much worth taking a look at some of the stuff Jeff Soro has done. He has a site called measuringusability.com, and it's got some really good tools on it, really good calculators, to show you the confidence with which you can extrapolate the data you get from user testing. That's not to say that if you can only test on 2 people that you shouldn't bother doing that. But I think it's quite useful to see that if you've tested on 2 people and you've determined a failure rate of 1 in 2, some of the stuff Jeff Soro's put up there will just show you how confident you can be that result can be extrapolated to the kind of the population at large. So it's worth taking a look at that, and it's got some good tools where you can kind of drag a slider, add more people, and just see what that's going to do to your confidence intervals. But we'll come back to this point in a bit, because I think it's quite an important one to address, the fact that we could all do with more test participants, but we're not always going to get them. Okay, so this one's pretty simple. A lot of researchers have found that there's this thing called order effect. If you give people 6 tasks in order and you get them to complete the tasks, they may struggle with task 1, and they may struggle a little less with task 2, and then they'll breeze through 3 to 6. In fact, 6 they'll do incredibly well. And it's not because task 6 was any easier than task 1, it's just that they've had a lot of practice. And we've already talked about randomization of tasks, and this is just another example of why it's a good idea to randomize tasks. And people are pretty unanimous on this. In fact, a lot of tools, such as the surveying tools out there, have built this in. So if you use things like SurveyMonkey or UserZoom, you'll probably find there's a little option, once you've built up all your tasks, to randomize these or randomize some of them. Obviously, not all tasks can be randomized because sometimes there's a bit of context and you're trying to make something natural. But where possible, it's very good to randomize. So let's recap on what we've covered so far. There's this thing called experimental bias that we learned about with the tale of clever hands. Researchers who want to believe something are going to believe it, and they'll bend their research technique to make sure that it gives them the results they want. We've got this thing called the Hawthorne effect, where if you observe people, they will probably work harder and perform better. There's also attitude polarization. The guy struggling against the world around him, trying to answer questions. The herd mentality is a very, very powerful force. Demand characteristics. My mate Steve, who tries to sabotage all my experiments. We've got to be careful about the way people act in experimental conditions. And we've got order effect. The order in which things are presented affects the way they are responded to. So these are 5 good ones, which I think are pretty easy to understand, quite easy to apply to improve your experimental technique. But there's a bunch more stuff out there, so I practically insist that you go and Google this stuff. There's loads more kinds of bias, loads more demand characteristics, and loads more things that you can do to improve your experimental technique. We're going to have a little task now. I'm going to try to go easy on you, but we're going to do one task. We're going to imagine now that we are part of the Windows 8, the proud Windows 8 design team, who are trying to test whether the Metro interface is actually easier to use than the Windows 7 menu. And so hopefully you would have got we've got a question. Yeah. So the question, I think, is that, so we have this experimental bias between the researcher and the subject, but when we have the design team looking at the results of testing, do they exhibit the same bias? That's a good question. I mean, yes, I mean, development teams do have a vested interest in the results of their experiments. And so everything is open to interpretation. I think if you bake in a good experimental technique, then you should get results which are at least valid data. And this can only get you so far. I think if you want to interpret things the way you want to interpret them, that's probably slightly different than designing an experiment to get the right results. So if we're saying we're getting genuine results and then choosing to interpret them in a certain way, I think it's a slightly different bias, but certainly a very problematic one, which also needs to be mitigated. And I'm not sure what the best way to mitigate that is. I mean, beyond healthy discussion and a kind of internal discipline not to let yourself get caught up in that kind of bias, which is actually a really good point, because I've suggested a bunch of solutions to all of these problems. But the solution which I haven't really gone into is that there's self-discipline involved in all of this. And that's something that you can't really fake or mandate on other people. So that's something we need to be aware of as researchers, that we need self-discipline. I hope that answers your question. So we've got this task where we want to figure out if Metro is better than Windows 7. And I have sketched out a rough plan of how we might do this, with some deliberate mistakes in it, or things that could be better. So I'd like to spend about 5 minutes either alone or in groups if you feel like it, just taking a look at the technique and seeing if we can improve it based on all of these variables. So we'll spend 5 or 10 minutes doing that, and then we'll talk.
Because you don't use the Oh, right.
Healthy conversation, and I think a few people have finished as well. So we'll wrap up there for now, but we're not done yet. So I think everyone understood the task well. We had some really good discussion just then about informed consent. We were thinking about the ASH study and thinking, would you be able to do that in modern times? Because you need to get consent with these things, and indeed that is an interesting point. I mean, there's some of this research with questionable ethics is a bit difficult to reproduce these days because we kind of decided that it was good to learn stuff from that, but you just can't go around telling people they're electrocuting other people, and you can't make them feel excluded, and you certainly can't lock them up in a basement, which is what Zimbardo did in the 70s. And so there's, the culture of research changes over time. There's a lot of stuff to talk about. But let's get back to the task at hand. So we had a plan for testing out a new element of Windows, which involved 1 experimenter, 5 participants, an introduction, and 6 ordered tasks. And now I'm going to ask you how we can make that experimental design a bit better. So how could we get around the problem of experimenter bias? Go on, Neil.
So one suggestion we had was, rather than having predefined tasks, we could use the participants to help determine some of the tasks.
That's interesting.
Or we could look at things like analytics so that we can see task usage. So it's not being driven by necessarily what we're looking to test.
Okay. So we can have subject-driven tasks, and we can also look at analytics, perhaps in a kind of benchmarking way. That's very good. And I think we've got another idea.
We looked at the wording of the question.
Okay.
And it sets out straight away to say the usability of, by examining the timing of, and a set of common tasks.
Right.
And that we didn't put you in a particular frame. And we looked at what the list of tasks were. Thought, frankly, they're not common tasks.
Okay.
They were very unusual tasks.
Right. So some of the wording is a bit leading and leads people down a path. And, okay, yeah, we've got another one.
The way Microsoft tested this, they were interested in the speed of things, which is why search is prominent. And they did actually use analytics to inform why they ended up with it. So it's demonstrated that analytics can lead in completely the wrong direction anyway.
Very interesting. Yep, analytics can be misleading. And, okay, we had a bit of insight into the research technique. Actually, I made up these tasks, so they're nothing to do with anything Microsoft may have done. But, yeah, those are all very good ideas. Another one is that we could split that relationship out so that we have an experimenter and a researcher. It's a bit of a luxury to have more people involved in this, but that is a way of separating the person with the dream from the person who's actually finding out whether the dream is true. That was very good. Okay, so what do we do about the Hawthorne effect? Someone from the team at the front. Don't watch them. That's good. Well, actually, it is good. If you can not watch them. Exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one-way glass, that is part of the point of one-way glass, is that you don't see that you're being observed, but of course you know that you are. But yeah, anything you can do to limit the extent to which you feel you're being observed. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Okay, products such as Open Hallway allow you to complete the user testing in your own remote location. So to some extent you are being observed, but to maybe less of an extent. Anil?
I think a point that we raised was
Yeah. Yeah, that came up in another one of the talks. A sterile environment is not very, or probably not very realistic, so if you can make it a bit more natural, that's a good thing to do. Okay, those are all very good ideas. What are we going to do about the problem of attitude polarization? People.
Separating them achieves the same effect if they can
Yeah.
see or hear what the others are doing.
That's true. Yes, so some of the solutions to the Hawthorne effect are very useful for this. In fact, a lot of the time you can kill two birds with one stone by separating people and by having loads more of participants. So indeed, if people can't see each other, then you kind of get around attitude polarization. Yeah, that's true. What about the screw you effect? People who are just trying to sabotage your research, what are you going to do about that? Yeah.
You might want to just ask them questions initially about what operating systems they currently use, because their comments might still be valuable, but you might want to weight them depending on.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. We haven't really talked about getting to know the test participant prior to the test, and absolutely, there may be some details of their background or their familiarity with products which would absolutely influence the way they answer. I mean, if you're testing out an Android app on a fanboy, you might find that they don't like it. And yeah, so that's a really good point. You could, yeah. I tend to do that sometimes. How about order effect? Yeah, that's the easiest one. Indeed, randomizing stuff just gets around that.
Yeah, but you do have a couple of tasks in here that are independent. So you cannot randomize everything or what makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, as I mentioned, you can't randomize everything. Some tasks have to be done in order. But that's an interesting point, because when you're coming up with the tasks, it's good to have a mixture of things which can be randomized and things which can't. I always think that's the kind of thing that I get a vision of someone's face telling me to make sure that I can make something randomizable, which is what I'm hoping to impart to you today. So yeah, absolutely, well done. You identified all the stuff that I've been talking about, which I don't think is rocket science, but it just takes a bit of drilling in to really internalize it. And actually, you came up with loads of other really good ideas, which I probably should add into this thing. So thank you very much for that. That was really helpful. So I'm gonna finish up by trying to ground this a bit more in practical reality, because all of this stuff is incredibly important, but it kind of assumes that we live in a world where we can get what we want really easily. If we need 100 more participants, we can just load them into the system, and we can have everyone in a panopticon where they can't see each other, and we can do pretty much anything we like. That's not the case in the real world. So I just want to show you some, so I want to demonstrate how an awareness of all of this stuff just influences the way I do user testing ever so slightly, but in ways which are worthwhile. So I had this problem a while ago where we needed an icon which said expand. So this is a really, really low-level kind of simple thing to sort out. But expand is not a very conventional thing to do. I'll spare you the context, but we're talking about bits of data which can be expanded. And our designer got quite into it, and he came up with about 20 different designs for expand. So I wanted to do some sort of card sort where people just group all of the designs and help me find out which one means expand to them. So I cut out all of the icons, put them on a table, and I thought, right, well, I'll get some Post-it notes, I'll write down some meanings, and I'll see how many they put in the expand column. And then I thought, actually, that's a little bit leading. As we said, the way you ask the question will determine the answer. So that's not good enough, I thought. Maybe we need some sort of blind going on. We need to obscure some of the information so that there's a gap and it's a bit more valid. So how about we don't write down what the meanings are, and we don't tell people that any of these icons are supposed to mean expand. It's a very small difference, but it added a bit of validity to the approach. So what this ended up being was I show you a bunch of icons, and you organize them into groups and tell me what the meanings are. And that's what this is. This is one person's results. And I was very pleased because they said that those two mean expand. And then I felt happy because I hadn't told them that any of them were expand, and yet these two looked like they were. So I thought, that's a good result. And I repeated this with a bunch of people, and sure enough, we got some consensus after a while. And we have an icon a little bit like that now, which we use for expand, and we're happy. There's another thing which is interesting about this, and that's that I did this it's kind of a micro test. This wasn't part of a bigger test plan. It was just, we were having this conversation one day, and I thought, okay, well, instead of discussing it, I'm just going to go and do some testing. But what that meant was that I didn't really have to take any one person's time, more than a couple of minutes. So I did a little mini roadshow around the office. Instead of getting people over to my desk, I just went around to people's desks and hassled them for 5 minutes, took a picture of the results, and then moved on. Which meant that I could pretty easily get about 20 responses. And usually, if I was doing a proper old test, you know, a half-hour or an hour session with someone, I wouldn't get through 20 in a week because you spend so much time writing things up, etc., and scheduling and working around people's schedules. Really difficult. But by doing this kind of micro-test with a simple technique, I could get around a bunch of stuff. So I got around the leading question problem. I got around the Hawthorne effect, I suppose, because because I got a lot of participants. Actually, the Hawthorne effect's a bad example, but I got around some of the other effects that are around the number of participants, basically. So that was a good thing. Here's another one. I call this the spot the ball technique. We were having this argument about button placement. Should the save button be in the top right or the lower right? I don't care to argue about this stuff if it's based on opinions. So I took the screen designs we had, covered up all of the buttons, and loaded it into UserZoom, sent it around to about 25 people internally again. And there was just one task, and the task was click save. And it produced this heat map. Some people think that you click save up there. One person, I think, thinks that you click save there. But there are these two hotspots, really here, arguably here, and definitely here. This is a very hot spot. And so I felt confident after that people want to click in the lower right. By the way, I don't go into this much depth with every single bit of design decision, but because how could you do that? But when we're having these kind of long arguments about stuff, then I try to resolve it this way. And so that was good. And again, using a survey tool where you can just send out an email to a bunch of people is really good because they don't need to work together, they can't see each other, there's no attitude polarization, but we did get consensus. And all in all, it was a fairly quick and easy way of getting valid data. So, hopefully, you will be able to regale these anecdotes of clever hands and the Hawthorne effect and attitude polarization, etc., etc. That is my dream. I'd be very happy if you could, from time to time, drop those into conversations when you're working with your teams. Not only will it improve your experimental technique, but I think it's good for the general culture of UX. I think people need to be reminded very gently that we're not kind of people in tight jeans who just sketch stuff out and come up with crazy ideas. We are very, very aware of empirical technique. We care about how we do our research, and we get valid results upon which we can act with confidence. That's all I got for you. Thank you very much.